What's up guys, welcome to this new YouTube channel and the first video. If you do not know me, I am the Adlad, Twitch streamer and full-time poker player, and today we will be reviewing a 6max final table that happened in Coventry a few months ago. I'm doing this because I'm going to be attending the Goliath next week, and of course I'm going to make the final table, guys. Is there any doubt? Is there any doubt? And I need to make sure I can squeeze out every little bit of EV from that spot when it comes. So we're going to do some ICM review. We're going to review some really weird looking decisions that happen here and see, are they GTO? Are they plus EV? Are they good decisions? And there's a very special player on the table, as you'll soon see. Let's jump right into it. Hey guys, here we are at the UK Student Poker Championships 2019 at 6max final table. The buy-in was £50 plus £7 UK pounds sterling, and with it being a 6max final table, naturally there are 6 players here, 5 of whom have the most stereotypical British white guy names possibly ever to be collected at a table together. So just on our right here we have Chris hiding behind the dealer. Just on the left of the dealer we have Ben with the AirPods in. We have Tom on the other side of the table with the UKSPC merch, which was probably horribly overpriced. We have Big Luke talking to his mate over there on the left, and just to the left here we have David. And just below me here, just down here, we have a very handsome player who I'm sure you all recognise, who will hereby be known as The Whale. So here we can see the chip counts, and the thing to notice here is that Ben and Tom are overwhelming chip leaders, controlling 81% of the chips between them, whereas the other 4 stacks are very short, with the Whale only having 12 big blinds and David only having 3. And this introduces a factor known as ICM, which means that some chips are more valuable than others. For example, consider the Whale. The Whale has 24.5k chips. If the Whale loses 24.5k chips in this next hand, it is an absolute disaster, because he will go home in 6th place and only get 6th place money. And, you know, that's just horrendously bad, given that he could just wait for the stacks to bust though. You know, David's probably going to bust pretty soon. Luke might bust before him. Chris might bust before him. Whereas he's not going to double up and get above Tom and Ben anytime soon. So the Whale and people around that spot have to play very, very tight and conservative. Whereas Ben has 167k chips. If he loses 24.5k chips, it isn't that bad. They're not very valuable to him. He'll still be in 1st place, he'll still have a lot of chips, he'll still have a good chance of getting 1st or 2nd place. So this creates this dynamic where the middling stacks are going to be playing very, very tight and trying not to lose chips, and the big stacks are going to be taking advantage of that by stealing their blinds with almost any 2 cards. That's what we're going to see here. Ben and Tom will be playing very aggressively, the Whale, Chris and Luke will be playing very tight, David will be looking for a double up, but generally playing quite tight as well, because he can make money by letting other people bust first.
They love to watch, and all those not on the feature table want to be on it, so that you get as close as they can. Love it.
So Christian's got an easy shove here, King Queen suited. But,
he's
just going to let it go.
Wow.
He's probably letting it go just because on the page ups there is someone with 3 bigs.
Well, I'd have been in. Oh,
Yeah.
saying I'd have been in, I'm glad I wouldn't have been in, because Davy's now all in.
Oh.
And he's running into the Whale. Adam Gill.
Who hasn't snap called for some reason.
What?
There we
Yeah,
go.
he has.
There we
He's
go.
put them in. There's the 10-second think tank with kings.
So here we see Christian waking up with the King-Queen suited here under the gun, and I think this is going to be a fairly clear jam. Of course, if there was no ICM involved, it would be a really easy jam. In fact, a hand as bad as King-7 suited here would be a profitable jam. But he is going to want to play quite a bit tighter than the chart because of this ICM factor that we discussed, namely that he really doesn't want to bust here before people like David and Luke. Now, I think that I do accept that he should be playing fairly tight here, but not as tight as to fold King-Queen suited. Particularly because no one else at the table is going to call him very light. Ben and Tom both realise that he has a very tight range here jamming under the gun, and Luke, David and the Whale are all similarly affected by ICM, and none of them want to call any bad hands at all. So I think this is going to be a somewhat profitable jam. However, he does fold, and we see folds around to David in the small blind, who wakes up with ace-queen offsuit. Now, he only has 4 big blinds, and he is the shortest stack as well, so he can't wait for other people to bust out quite as much, because if everyone waits, David will be the first person to bust. So he's going to have to jam a range somewhat close to the charts here, and the charts are going to be pretty wide. Ace-queen off is going to be a slam dunk jam into the whale, and the whale is going to wake up with kings. Now, the whale can call this pretty wide, I think, but not terribly wide. He's calling 6k into a pot of 11.9k. So he's getting about 2-to-1 odds on a call, and he's going to be getting that with almost any hand versus the jam that David's going to make. Now, there is some ICM factors involved, but even if the whale loses 4 big blinds here, it isn't going to be the end of the world, really. He's still going to have one of those middling stacks, and he's still going to have a chance to wait for everyone else to bust. So I think the whale has to call pretty damn light here. Obviously, kings is going to be a really easy call here. The tank, just to be clear, was not a me thinking about it, was not me worrying about whether I should call kings or not. It was a failed slow roll that I pussied out of.
So David at risk, going to need to find an ace to keep his tournament alive.
Does he do it? That doesn't help.
No help there, no runners either. So just an ace needed.
Oh, the ace from space is there.
There is a redraw though.
But there's a redraw with the king of hearts. The king of hearts has got the draw, but misses.
Always an ace, folks. Always an ace when you got kings. That's why you tank, and that, kids, is why you don't slow roll against a Sunrunner. So we lose the all-in, and that puts us in the unfavourable spot of being last place, but we are very, very close together in terms of chips, with 4 players having between 10 and 7 big blinds moving into this next hand. The ICM here is going to get pretty insane.
They may want to ladder. It depends, really, but you expect, like, even here, Tom with ace-8, he's got a direct blocker with the ace. You expect them to come in for an open here, just because it's going to get through so often, and especially if we know people are folding hands like king, queen, yeah.
That'll do.
So effective stack 10.
We see something quite interesting happening here. The 4 players with the shorter stacks are all at this end of the table towards the camera. So Ben and Tom can start putting a lot of pressure on, but in particular Tom can, because when Ben folds, Tom doesn't have to worry about losing more than like 20k of his stack, which is virtually irrelevant to his stack. And so when he jams here, he's going to get a lot of folds because Luke, David, the whale and Christian all have this ICM pressure on and really don't want to be the next to bust. And so Tom can start jamming here with virtually any 2 cards. It doesn't really matter what he has. He's almost never going to get called unless someone wakes up with a premium. A few more hands pass by. David gets the through, jams a few. There's a couple of fairly tight folds, I think. But I think most of everything that happens here is pretty standard. But then we get this spot where Luke wakes up with the king 6 off. He's going to have to jam. David wakes up with 9s. Snap call. And we're going to see what happens here.
David's doubled up.
Yeah, Luke's a short
So
stack.
he's now got Luke covered. Luke Maskell from the University of Kent is in our heads up quarter-finals tomorrow, is Luke. So I'm sure we'll see him again.
Yeah, he needs help here,
But
though.
he needs help now, he needs a king. He is drawing to one of those king things. And it isn't Luke Maskell, first man out, finished in 6th, the 100.
And with that,
well done,
we
Luke.
ladder up, we get
He
5th
came
place,
to the table
and now we only have one more
16,000.
person at the same stack size as us.
David up to 20 big
The
blinds.
question is, can we outlast
2
Christian
stacks, sub
to get the
7
4th
bigs.
place? We'll see. So, the very next shuffle, Christian folds the under the gun, Ben folds the cutoff, and Tom wakes up on what is the effective button with 7-4 off. Now, I have about 5 bigs effective because I had to post a big blind ante. Chris has 7 big blinds, and David has 20 big blinds. Now, given this situation, I think that Tom should be jamming any 2 cards, even a hand as bad as this. And the reason for it is because of those ICM factors that we discussed. David has a much bigger stack than either me or Christian, so he's going to have to fold a lot, because if he busts here in 5th place, it's going to be pretty disastrous for him. Also, I in the big blind can fold more than normal because Christian's going to be in the big blind next hand, and we're going to have very similar stack sizes. There's a decent chance that he can bust before me again. Also, I'm not going to be in the big blind for another 5 hands, so I can even maybe get away with folding it over and over again for another 3 hands. Now, I can see Tom doesn't want to jam 7-4 off if he thinks I am going to call the correct amount, the chip EV amount, because that won't be profitable. He'll be behind almost every time, and I'll double up a substantial amount of the time. But I don't think that's true against most people, and so I think he should be jamming. Also, 7-4 off is the nuts. However, he does fold. We get David, who should be jamming a fairly normal range, and I'm just going to fold Queen Deuce off for the reasons that I suggested. I was ahead, but I think I should still fold to try and let Christian bust before me, and because I don't have to pay the big blind for another several hands. The next hand we see a similar thing happening with Ben and Tom finding folds and David going for it with the 8-7 off, and he understands here exactly why he should be jamming any 2 here. We know already that Chris is a very tight player, and both me and Chris are very short, so even if he gets it in, he's not going to be doing too badly, and he's not going to lose too big of a portion of his stack. Additionally, me and Chris are both incentivized to try and fold to let the other person bust first. So he does jam 8-7 off. We have a pretty easy fold with 5 deuce, so I'm not going to call any 2. And Christian really needs to be calling ace-7 off here. It's going to be far ahead of David's any 2 range. He's not going to busto me too often, and if he does double up, he almost always gets at least 4th. So I think he has a pretty clear call with ace-7 off. He can play relatively tight, but he can't be folding ace-7 off for the 7 big blinds here against what is very likely an any 2 range. So once again, Christian displays nitty tendencies. Here's what I was thinking in my head while Chris was tanking. You're a nit, Chris, and you folded too much, but you know you're just gonna get 5th. You've got a call with an ace and a 7. You've got a call with an ace and a 7. You're a nit, Chris, but you folded too much, and you know you're just gonna get 5th. You're a classic tournament nit, a tournament nit.
The shorties get out of the way again, and should be jamming here. You expect as Tom, if I'm in Tom's shoes, should be jamming any 2 into David's stack. Even 8-5 at diamonds here, so just a great hand to jam. David has to call off with the top of his range with a 5 and a 4 big blind stack. Like, he should be folding so many hands here, but Tom elects to complete, take the lower variance line, and we'll see a flop.
Jack 5 deuce checked. 4 of spades on the turn. Flush draws are plenty.
Yeah, brings David in a up and down straight draw here, so Tom going to get 1 street of value from his pair of 5s here. Can't see David going anywhere. He'll make the call.
Has he hit it?
He has.
He has indeed. He has indeed with the 3 of spades.
We've got an easy check here now as Tom, and I think if David comes out firing, we're just going to have to let it go. Too much completes, backdoor spades.
Half pot.
The only real hands that we beat in this spot are just missed clubs, and missed clubs should be betting the flop quite a high frequency of the time, blind on blind. So I think after some contemplation, Tom will let this one go. And then other hands like the straight draws now even make a pair that's better than ours or a straight, but he is going to pay it off. He's going to make the hero call. David.
So David has moved his stack up even more.
Yeah.
What way, David? Got a bit of...
Hey guys, no, I haven't changed my shirt. Your eyesight's just not as good as you remember. Now, we do see Ben and Tom here playing a few small pots, but nothing too major, and then this hand pops up, and I think this is a rather interesting hand, because I think Tom makes some significant mistakes that we can look to mitigate in our own game. So, we fold, Chris folds, Ben folds, and it folds to Tom. In the small blind...
Tom's shoes should be jamming any 2 into...
So, David has about 25 big blinds. Me and Chris both have about 5 big blinds. What that means is that David is facing a lot of ICM pressure from Tom here. If David busts here, it's an absolute disaster given how close me and Chris are to busting. What that means is that Tom can play very, very aggressively here, and David can't really do anything about it. Now, I actually disagree with the commentators that we should be jamming any 2 here. David will fold a lot, but he's a little bit too deep, and when David does call, we will stand to lose a lot of chips, so much so that we won't generate enough from his folds to make up for it. Now, I do think Tom should be doing a ton of raising, and I think it makes sense because David's going to have to play very tight. He's not going to be able to do a ton of 3-bet jamming. He's not going to be able to play aggressively post-flop. He's not going to be able to call the bad hands that he might call otherwise. So I think Tom should definitely be looking to raise a lot of hands, maybe close to any 2. That said, he can get away with doing some limping if he wants to, and I don't mind having a few limps in there, and I think that a hand like 8-5 of diamonds makes a lot of sense for it. What's particularly nice about having 8-5 of diamonds here is it's a really nice hand to start limp re-raising as a bluff if we think David is raising too much, and David's going to have to fold a ton if we limp re-raise, and it's going to be very, very profitable here with the 8-5 of diamonds, assuming David raises a decent proportion of the time. We do see Tom go for the limp. I think it's fine. And we have David. And with Queen 3 off here in the big blind, David has a very clear check. He's going to want to do a fair bit of checking for the reasons we discussed just now. And I think Queen 3 off is just a bad hand. Not really many good things happen when we raise. Very clear check. So we see a flop of Jack 5 deuce with a flush draw, and Tom does something quite interesting here. He goes for the check. Now, in this situation, I think that Tom wants to be using a strategy whereby he bets 100% of his range. It is a little iffy because this board is going to favour David in general, since David's going to check back more strong hands than Tom is going to limp pre. However, that doesn't matter so much because a lot of that range advantage comes from David having air hands that have higher showdown value than Tom's air hands here. David's going to have a lot of those hands like Queen 10, like King 8, like 10-9, like Ace 3, hands that have some showdown value but are still just air. Tom, therefore, can get a lot of that air to fold if he bets. David can't really realise that equity that he has with those air hands. He can't raise over a bet very often. He can't stab turn if Tom checks it very often. And he has to fold a lot of those hands just to a single bet on the flop. So with that said, that means that Tom is going to have a profitable bet with any 2 cards here, and that is the easiest way to play this spot. It's just to stab your entire range, particularly on this dry of a board. Now, Tom does go for the check here, but particularly when we have 8-5 of diamonds, this hand is very likely to be ahead of David's range, but it's also going to benefit very heavily from getting David to fold those hands like Queen 10, like Queen 9, like 10-9. Those kind of hands, even a hand such as the hand that David has, Queen 3, is very beneficial when that hand folds, when we have the 8-5 of diamonds here. I think it's possible that Tom is looking for the check raise here, which can be fine if he thinks that David's going to stab a lot versus check. But I think that it is a little bit hard to balance, and also I think it's fairly unlikely that David's going to bet here a ton. Also, 8-5 of diamonds isn't really the best hand to do it with, particularly because he's just going to run into a jack very often. I would much prefer to see Tom go for check raises with hands like flush draws, like straight draws, and he can balance that out by throwing in some jack X from time to time. He does, however, go for the check, and we're on David. Now, it's very difficult to know what Tom is checking here. It's very unlikely that anyone really checks air in Tom's shoes, unless they're going for a strategy like I suggested. That said, some people here will be extremely unbalanced with their checking. Some people will only ever check marginal hands like a 5, like pocket 3s, like ace high, and some people will check loads of hands that are traps, such as aces, such as jacks, such as ace jack. So when it goes to David here, he really has to be wary of Tom's check raises and also traps, and so he can't bet very frequently. In particular, he's going to get check raised a fair bunch if he starts betting too much here. And so he wants to bet with a range that does okay versus check raises. And the answer to that is to use a very polarized strategy. So he's definitely going to want to bet if he has a jack, because he can still call that versus a check raise. He's not going to want to bet any worse hands than a jack for value, because the threat of the check raise is so great that he will end up folding too much. In addition, he doesn't want to use hands like flush draws and straight draws as bluffs here, but prefers to use hands that have decent removal and decent backdoor equity, such as Queen 3 off. There's loads of great turns that can come for this hand. A 4 is pretty good, a 6 is okay, an ace isn't that bad, a club's pretty good, a queen is pretty good. That's like half the deck. With that in mind, Queen 3 off seems like a pretty decent bet candidate for me, but I can also see David's argument for wanting to check a ton here, and I think it's okay. I would personally look to bets, but we do see a turn. Turn comes the 4 of spades, and despite what the graphics guy says, Tom goes for a bet of 3k into the pot of 5k, and I like this play. He's going to still be ahead of David's range for a lot, and I like the play based on many of the factors that we talked about on the flop, but now it's even better because David has more hands that we want to protect against and get value from. Hands like a 4, hands like a 3, hands like a backdoor spade draw. David can have all of these hands because of how often he's going to check the flop. So I think this bet makes a lot of sense. I also like the sizing, and we go over to David. David in this situation with his Queen 3, folding is out of the question. He's going to have too much equity, and moreover, he's going to have too many implied odds versus Tom's bet. That is, when he hits his straight, he's often going to get value on the river. So the question is, do we want to call or raise? And I think if we weren't in an ICM pressure spot here, I think we would want to use this combo as a raise fairly frequently. It's definitely going to be very nice to have some high clubs in there as well, so that we can effectively bluff club rivers. That said, the ICM spot here is pretty huge, and as a result, David can't raise a ton of combos. So while this could be an okay raise in there from time to time, I think once again we want to use a strategy whereby we are raising very polar hands and staying away from hands like a flush draw, like a straight draw as raises, because we're going to have to fold them if Tom goes for the 3-bet jam. So I like the call from David, and we're going to see a river. And no, it ain't the Mississippi, it's the 6 of spades, which is a disaster card for our boy Tom, one of the worst rivers in the deck. Now all of David's 3x improves, all of his backdoor spade draw improves, some hands with a 6 like 6-5 or 6-4 are going to improve, a hand like 6-7 improves. Tom is going to be behind way too much of David's range here on this river to even consider going for a value bet. He has a very clear check with his 8-5, and he does agree with me. Then it's on to David, and the question is, what size does David want to bet here with his straight? And I think the answer is quite big. I think we would want to bet fairly polar here because of the threat of the check raise. And also, another reason to bet big here is that Tom barely ever has air here, but he also barely ever has the nuts here. He almost never has a better straight or a flush, because most of those hands would look to bet the flop. So I think when Tom is very clearly going to be weighted towards one pair here, we're going to want to bet fairly large. We're not too as worried about the check raise, again because Tom doesn't have much air and he doesn't have much flushes. So he's going to have a lot of middling hands that are not going to want to raise. I think I would go for a size like 80% pot here. David goes a little bit smaller and goes for a half pot, and I can see this being okay as well. A nice advantage of this is that he can induce a check raise a bit more often if Tom is tricked into thinking that David can be value betting very thin here. It also means that David can value bet very thin here. If David has a hand like 6-5, maybe he'll want to go for a smaller size. If David's a real sicko, he could maybe go for it with a hand like 6-7, although I sort of doubt that would happen. In terms of what hands David can look to bluff here, I think the most obvious candidate is going to be the club draws that we agreed would check back the flop, but that would look to call the turn and would reach this river having no showdown value. I think those are the most obvious candidates. There's not going to be a ton of other hands in David's range. Maybe once in a while he might have a hand like, I don't know, Ace-9, which could call the turn, but I think the club draws are going to be the most obvious bluffs for David.
And I think if David comes out firing,
so he goes for 6k bets, which I think is an okay size, although I would bet bigger. And on Tom here, he's simply going to have to fold. The problem for Tom here is, this is the reason why it becomes such a tough spot, and this is why we talked about the flop a lot, is because Tom's range here is extremely weak. Tom almost never has a 3, because those would mostly bet the flop. He almost never has a set, because those would mostly bet the flop. He almost never has 2 pair, because a lot of those hands would look to bet the flop. He almost never has a flush, because a lot of the backdoor straight draws would look to bet the flop, along with a lot of the backdoor flush draws. So I think that, given that, Tom is going to really struggle to defend it enough on this river. Now, that said, I think that we can just look to fold most of our range here on the river. We could be really cheeky and go for the raise, but it's somewhat unlikely that David is going to fold a 3. And when we aren't really repping a flush particularly well, we want to not raise very often, and we would want to prefer to raise a hand that at least had a good spade in. So I think Tom has a pretty clear fold. I think Tom is going to have some hands like aces, like a strong jack here, and those make quite a lot of sense as a call. For what it's worth, I do think that it is quite good that Tom doesn't have a club in his hand, because we said that those are the kind of hands that David is going to bet. But I think there are many better hands that Tom can look to call here, and it's also pretty difficult for David to find bluffs. He has to basically only have a club draw, whereas he can have tons of combos of value. So I think Tom has a pretty clear fold. Tom disagrees with me and pays off like the wizard he is.
The only real hands that we beat in this spot are just missed clubs, and missed clubs should be betting the flop quite a high frequency at the time, blind on blind. So I think after some contemplation, Tom will let this one go. And then other...
Yeah, I'm lead for the B. I'm at the top round dogs with me. If you don't know about me, yeah, I'm lead for the B. I'm at the top round dogs with me. If you don't know about me, yeah,
So I think the biggest lesson to take from this hand is that when we make our ranges extremely narrow on early streets, we're going to struggle to deal with very dynamic runouts that heavily favour certain portions of the range. And so I think it's very important to make sure that you are either using strategies where you mix in several different kinds of hands, or just betting your whole range on flops like this. And I think that's the biggest lesson to take away from this. So that's going to conclude part 1 of this review of the 6max final table. We will have part 2 coming out later this week. Make sure you tune in to see if this guy can ship this motherfucking final table for 1,050 UK pounds sterling. You know it's gonna be hype. Make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss part 2 coming later this week, or the upcoming Goliath vlog. I can already tell you guys, you're not going to want to miss that. And if you like what you've seen here and you want to see more, I stream 4 days a week online poker over at twitch.tv/theadlad19. And I'll see you next time, where we're going to make some money and make some memories. Thanks for watching.